Rain hit the windshield in a steady, impatient rhythm, and the wipers didn't seem to keep up. I sat beside her, shoulder brushing hers, but it felt like a chasm had opened between us. The car was quiet, except for the occasional rumble of thunder and the faint hiss of tires on wet asphalt. She didn't speak. She didn't even glance at me. Her fingers were tight around the wheel, knuckles white, and every so often, I caught her jaw tighten as if she was holding back words I wasn't meant to hear. I tried to find something, anything, to break the silence. The weather's really something tonight, I said, voice a little too loud, too shaky. She let out a short laugh, but it was empty. Almost forced. My chest tightened. I realized that even that small attempt at normalcy had failed. I shouldn't have even tried. I wanted to ask her what was wrong. I wanted to reach across the console and grab her hand, pull her into whatever bubble of safety we used to have. But something in her posture froze me. She was distant, her body taut like a drawn bow, and I couldn't tell if it was me or something else that had pushed her away. I tried scanning the streetlights, hoping the passing blur of orange light would distract me, give me a moment to breathe. But every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, pressing closer, whispering doubts I wasn't ready to hear. My mind kept spinning. Circling the same questions over and over. Had I done something wrong? Was it something she'd seen or heard? Or had this distance always been there, hidden, just waiting for the right storm to surface? And then I remembered her parents. I caught myself blaming them before I even thought it through. Maybe they'd said something. Maybe they were influencing her, shaping her thoughts, planting ideas I'd never agree with. It made sense, or at least, it felt like it did in that moment. It was easier to assign blame outward than to face the gnawing uncertainty inside. Her silence stretched on, long enough that I started noticing the small details, the way her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more often than the road, the subtle tap of her foot against the brake pedal, the shallow rhythm of her breathing. I wanted to ask her again. I wanted to push past it. But I didn't. Not yet. Because sometimes, the longer you wait, the more the truth reveals itself, though tonight, the truth felt slippery, like water running off the glass. I didn't know what was breaking us. I only knew I could feel it. And sitting there, in the cold hum of the car, with rain soaking the world outside, I realized that whatever had shifted between us had already started to crack something I wasn't sure I could ever fix. Before that night, things had felt simple. Not perfect, but steady. We had routines, little rituals that made the world feel smaller, safer. Morning coffee together, even if we were both half asleep, trading sleepy jokes about who burned the toast. Saturday mornings were for groceries and wandering the streets without purpose, the kind of wandering that left our hands brushing in the cart or her resting on my arm while she leaned into me. Simple things, nothing dramatic, but they mattered. Her laugh was easy then, spilling over without thought, filling the apartment like sunlight. I remember the way she'd tilt her head when she listened, like the world outside the conversation didn't exist. I trusted her then. Not blindly, but in that grounded way you trust someone who has shown up again and again. And I believed, naively maybe, that she'd always be there, that our bond was solid enough to withstand anything external. Her family was a part of our lives too. I liked them, mostly. Her mom had a warm way of fussing over every meal, every little detail, and her dad had a quiet humor that caught me off guard sometimes. They were present. But their presence was predictable, controlled. I never felt threatened by them, only aware that they had their opinions, their perspectives on the world, and that sometimes those perspectives clashed with mine. It didn't bother me at first. I thought influence was normal, part of loving someone who had roots elsewhere. We argued sometimes, small things, trivial disagreements, but they ended quickly. Mostly, I told myself that any tension from her family stayed outside the walls of our apartment. And for months, it did. We had shared secrets, too. Not deep, dark confessions, but small vulnerabilities that built a bridge between us. She'd tell me about her insecurities at work, the projects that kept her up at night, and I'd listen, sometimes offering advice, often just letting her vent. And I trusted that she did the same with me. The pattern was comforting, like a rhythm my heart recognized and leaned into. Yet, even in those easy days, I caught glimpses, tiny flickers, of distance. A pause too long before answering a question, a sigh when I mentioned seeing friends, a subtle tension when her parents called and she stepped away. I dismissed it then. I told myself she was tired, distracted, overworked. I wanted to believe the bridge was intact, even if I sometimes noticed a crack in the mortar. Sitting there later, in the car under the rain, I would replay those moments in my head. The laughter, the errands, the quiet evenings, all of it felt like memories from someone else's life. And I wondered, for the first time, whether the tiny cracks I had ignored were always there, quietly waiting to grow. Something that seemed stable, familiar, was starting to feel fragile, and yet, I still wanted to blame someone else. Anyone else. Her family. Her job. The world outside our apartment. It was easier than admitting the truth might be closer to home, closer than I was willing to face. I remember the way I used to feel around her, anchored. Not just comfort, but certainty. When she laughed at something I said, or reached for my hand in the middle of a chaotic day, it wasn't just affection. It was a signal that we were aligned, that the world outside didn't matter as long as we had this small bubble of understanding. I invested in that bubble, in ways I didn't always notice. I invested time. Countless nights talking until the city went silent. Evenings spent assembling IKEA furniture or arguing about the right way to load the dishwasher, ridiculous, meaningless moments that somehow cemented a sense of partnership. I invested emotion. I let myself feel completely. Without reservation, sharing fears I had never admitted out loud, letting her see the parts of me I normally kept behind careful walls. And I invested trust. Not the blind, naive kind, but deliberate, careful trust. Trust that she wouldn't walk away, trust that she'd meet me halfway, trust that what we had mattered more than anyone else's opinions. I thought I understood her too. Not every thought, of course, but enough to feel secure. I knew her little habits, the way she paused mid-sentence when she was thinking, the way she organized her workspace, the exact angle she tilted her head when she wanted me to notice something without saying it. I memorized those small gestures because they became my map of her mind. My way of navigating the spaces between us. And that security. It made me vulnerable in ways I didn't anticipate. I began to rely on her approval without noticing it, measuring myself by her reactions. I believed that if she faltered, if she withdrew even slightly, it had to be the world's fault, never mine. That's how invested I was. My confidence in our bond became a lens through which I interpreted every action, every pause, every word, but that lens also blinded me. I ignored subtle signs of discomfort, shrugged off the occasional distracted look, chalked up her quiet moments to stress or fatigue. I assumed that nothing could shake the foundation we'd built. I assumed that the investment I had poured into us would be enough to weather any storm. It's strange, looking back. I can see the cracks now, faint but persistent. Moments I dismissed as inconsequential, a fleeting hesitation before answering, a sigh at the wrong time, were quietly pointing to something I didn't want to admit. I was so invested in our connection, so convinced that trust was absolute, that I failed to notice the subtle shifts in her energy. I failed to notice that even strong bonds can erode quietly, imperceptibly, before they fracture completely, and yet, at that time, I felt untouchable. The world outside our apartment, her family, her friends, they might as well have been ghosts. They couldn't touch what we had built, because I had invested everything I was willing to give into us. Or so I thought. Sitting in the car later, watching the rain blur the streetlights, I realized the vulnerability I had ignored was exactly the vulnerability I would be forced to confront. That trust one had treasured so dearly wasn't invincible. And whatever had started to change between us was about to test it in ways I couldn't have imagined. It started small. Almost laughably small, at first. A pause too long before she answered my questions. A glance that lingered somewhere other than me. I noticed it first over coffee one Saturday morning, the sunlight spilling through the kitchen window, the way she stirred her mug absent-mindedly while I spoke. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I dismissed it immediately. She was tired, or maybe distracted by work. That had to be it, but then the pauses grew. Little things became patterns. She stopped sharing the trivial details she used to offer freely, the little frustrations at work, the jokes she overheard on the street, even the small victories she used to announce with pride. Sometimes I'd ask, casually, about her day, and she'd respond with monosyllables, eyes scanning her phone as if something more interesting had appeared. A flicker of doubt crept in, subtle but persistent. I started noticing the way her body angled subtly away from me on the couch, how her hand would hover near mine but never quite touch. Even when we were doing the same things we always did, cooking dinner, folding laundry, running errands, something had shifted. The rhythm we'd relied on for months was offbeat, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt completely in sync with her. Her parents became an easy target for my frustration. Every offhand comment, every suggestion, even the things she mentioned in passing, seemed loaded now. Maybe she's just repeating what her mom said, I thought. Maybe her dad planted that idea, or her sister influenced her without realizing it. It was a convenient explanation. It felt like a solution. And for a moment, I clung to it desperately, because it was easier than facing the gnawing possibility that the distance wasn't caused by anyone else. It might have been something I had missed, something that existed between us alone. I tried to test it, in my own way. I'd ask her opinions, gently prod for her thoughts, hoping to catch a spark of the old connection. But each time, her answers were measured, cautious, guarded in a way that felt deliberate. And each time, my heart sank a little. I began to doubt myself. Was I imagining it? Was I reading too much into harmless habits? Or was there really a wedge growing where I hadn't noticed one before? One evening, she left her phone on the counter while she grabbed a glass of water. I hesitated, staring at the screen. Nothing obvious, just messages I couldn't read, notifications I couldn't interpret. My chest tightened. The fear didn't make sense, but it was there. My mind started racing with scenarios, all plausible, all terrifying. The world I had believed was solid and safe suddenly felt precarious. Like walking on cracked ice, and still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. I told myself I needed more evidence, more clarity. But each small act of distance, the pauses, the fleeting glances, the careful phrasing of her words, was like a countdown I couldn't stop. I could feel the tension coiling tighter between us, silent but undeniable, and I knew that whatever was coming next wouldn't be something I could easily explain away. The first time I noticed it clearly, I froze without knowing why. She'd been texting under the table during dinner, fingers moving faster than her eyes. I didn't see the message itself, but the way her shoulders tensed, the way her thumb hovered over the screen when she sensed me looking, it felt deliberate, calculated. A small thing, but my stomach twisted. I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was coordinating a work thing, a friend's party, anything but what my mind immediately leapt to, but the doubts didn't stay buried. They crept into every interaction. She started leaving the room during calls, closing tabs when I walked by, muttering something about emails but not explaining. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the soft ping of her phone and see her sitting in the dark, scrolling, her face lit in pale glow. I told myself I had no right to invade her privacy, but the suspicion, it clung to me. Like a shadow, it moved with every step I took, and I couldn't shake it. I began replaying conversations in my head, twisting her words, reading into the tone, the pauses, the hesitation. Why did she phrase it like that? I asked myself, over and over. Why the pause? Why the smile that didn't reach her eyes? Every small anomaly became a thread I pulled at, unraveling the fabric of certainty I'd built around us. My mind constructed scenarios like a meticulous architect. Each more convincing than the last. Her family, of course, was easy to blame. I imagined whispered conversations, subtle suggestions planted in her mind. Maybe her mother had implied I was overbearing, maybe her father questioned my intentions, maybe even her sister had said something offhand that made her doubt me. It made sense, on paper, at least. If I could attribute her behavior to someone else, I could preserve the narrative that I wasn't failing, that I wasn't the one at fault. Then came the messages I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't snoop, I tell myself that, but when her phone buzzed on the counter, my eyes caught the snippet of a name I didn't recognize. My pulse spiked. I told myself it meant nothing, a coworker, a distant cousin, a friend. But the seed had been planted. Every look, every smile that felt out of place, every unexplained absence began to reinforce the idea that something, or someone, was turning her against me, and yet, there were moments that confused me. Little flashes of her old self, her laugh, that tilt of her head when she listened, the way she reached for my hand for a brief instant. I clung to these moments like lifeboats in stormy water. They reassured me, temporarily, that maybe I was imagining the worst. But then another flicker of suspicion would hit, a message ping, a shadow in her expression, a vague excuse, and I'd be pulled right back into doubt, the tension built in my chest like a storm I couldn't escape. I wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but fear held me back. Fear of being wrong. Fear of what I might discover. And fear, too, that if I pressed, I would fracture what little connection we still had. So I waited, silently, observing, twisting each tiny inconsistency into evidence. By the time I went to bed that night, the doubts had taken root. I couldn't see straight. The woman I had trusted completely now seemed distant. Unknowable, and I felt powerless. Every instinct screamed that someone, her family, the world outside, was influencing her, turning her away from me. And I was left sitting in the dark, heart pounding, wondering if the distance between us was something I could ever bridge, or if it had already become permanent. It felt like a breakthrough, the kind you cling to when your mind is drowning in doubt. I had cornered the problem, or at least, I thought I had. After days of watching her behavior, piecing together snippets, I confronted her gently one evening. We sat at the small kitchen table, rain streaking the windows again, and I asked the question that had been eating at me, is something going on with your family? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Are they influencing you? Saying things about me? She paused. Long enough that my chest ached with anticipation. Then she sighed, small and resigned, and nodded. Maybe, she said softly. They've been worried. Maybe they've said things I didn't notice at the time. I felt a rush of relief. Finally, a concrete explanation. Not her fault. Not my fault. Just outside pressure, a force I could rationalize and accept. I let my shoulders relax, let the tightness in my chest ease. In that moment, everything seemed to make sense. All the pauses, the glances, the distance, it wasn't me, it wasn't our bond, it was them. Her parents, her family, the invisible influence I had imagined. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe. I imagined her quietly listening to me now, acknowledging that I was still here, still present. I told myself I understood. I forgave her internally, even if she hadn't asked for it. I wanted to move forward. We spent the next hour talking. Carefully, gently, and I could almost feel the tension easing. She smiled once, briefly, and it felt like a return to normalcy. But even as I clung to that relief, tiny things nagged at me. The words felt incomplete. She said maybe, not yes. There was hesitation in her tone, a subtle tightness I couldn't ignore. Her eyes flicked to the counter where her phone lay, just out of reach, and she glanced away too quickly. My rational mind told me I was imagining it. After all, I had my answer now, but the unease persisted, a faint itch I couldn't scratch. I tried to let it go. I told myself the family explanation made sense. It was neat. It was tidy. And I wanted neat. I needed it to be tidy. I wanted to believe that the only thing standing between us and the way things had been was an external factor I could plan around. Manage, neutralize. For a few days, it worked. I watched her relax slightly, and I convinced myself I could see the old spark returning. We talked, we laughed, we slipped back into the routines I had once taken for granted, the grocery trips, the shared coffee, the evening spent curled on the couch with the TV flickering in the background. It felt like the storm had passed, but the storm doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Quiet, patient, hidden in the corners. Even in those moments of relief, I couldn't shake the feeling that a shadow lingered behind her eyes, a subtle hesitation I didn't yet understand. I told myself it was nothing, that the family influence had explained it all. But deep down, I already knew, though I didn't dare admit it yet, that this partial truth, comforting as it was, wasn't the whole story. And somewhere, beyond the reassurance of neat explanations, the real fracture was still waiting, silent, ready to reveal itself in a way I couldn't have anticipated. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to relax. Her nod, her soft admission, it had seemed like the answer. I convinced myself the distance, the subtle coldness, had a logical, external explanation. Her family. Their opinions. That had to be it. But as the days passed, small inconsistencies began to gnaw at me, like water slowly seeping through cracks in concrete. She'd laugh, sometimes, and for a second, it felt genuine. Then, just as quickly, the laugh would falter, the smile slipping into something more guarded. One night, I caught her staring out the window, phone in hand, typing a message she didn't send. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that she was just distracted or tired. But the nagging doubt wouldn't go away. I started noticing the subtle habits I had dismissed before, the way she lingered in another room before answering, the micropauses in her speech, the fleeting looks away that didn't make sense if she was simply thinking about her family's opinions. My mind, desperate for clarity, tried to fit the pieces together, but they didn't align. The neat narrative I had clung to was starting to unravel, even her words began to feel different. Casual phrases I remembered from before, the ones that once felt intimate, suddenly sounded like scripts. She laughed at jokes I hadn't made, remembered details I hadn't told her. At first, I rationalized it as coincidence. Or maybe she had just been more observant than I realized. But something about it felt off. Too precise. Too calculated. I replayed our conversations in my head, searching for the moment I had misread. Was there a point where I could have acted differently? Could I have noticed something she wanted me to see, or ignored something she didn't? The more I analyzed, the less I trusted my own judgment. The external explanation, the family, the influence, no longer sufficed. It didn't account for the nuances, the fleeting gestures, the tiny shifts that didn't fit the narrative I had accepted, and yet, I still hesitated. Confrontation felt dangerous. The idea that I might be wrong, that I might misinterpret her intentions, terrified me. So I waited. I watched. I collected fragments, hoping to make sense of them before they slipped through my fingers. But the more I watched, the clearer it became, the story I had told myself, the neat, tidy version where her family was the villain, was incomplete. I began to notice subtle signs of her independence, too. She made choices without consulting me. Small ones at first, what to cook, which route to take on our errands, the music playing while we drove. Nothing alarming, but enough to spark unease. The moments were small, almost imperceptible, yet they felt like signals I couldn't decode. Each one chipped away at the false certainty I had relied on. By the time the weekend came, I realized I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something about her had shifted, not because of anyone else, not because of her family, but because of something closer. Something I had been too invested, too confident, too blind to recognize. And though I didn't understand it yet, I knew that the real fracture between us was waiting, quietly, ready to surface. The next few days were unbearable in a quiet, creeping way. Every small gesture, every nuance of her behavior, felt magnified. I couldn't stop analyzing her movements, the way she paused mid-step, the subtle hesitations in her voice, the way she would drift off in thought while we were doing mundane things. It was like trying to read shadows on the wall. Something was there, but I couldn't put my finger on it. One evening, I noticed her staring at a notebook she kept tucked in the corner of the living room. She flipped pages slowly, tracing lines with her finger, whispering words under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. I asked her about it casually. She laughed it off, saying it was nothing. Just some old sketches and notes. But the tension in her shoulders, the tight line of her lips, it didn't match her explanation. My stomach twisted. There was something she wasn't telling me, something she hadn't been ready to show. I started paying attention to the way she interacted with other people, even in small, everyday moments. A brief smile at the barista that lingered too long. A quiet text exchanged while walking down the street. A quick glance at someone's profile on her phone before shutting it too quickly. These weren't dramatic betrayals, nothing that could be pinned down easily. But they carried weight, the subtle presence of a connection I hadn't noticed before. And then there were the almost imperceptible signs from her eyes, the way they darted toward the doorway when she heard a sound, or how they softened when she thought no one was looking. It was like she was living with two realities at once, one for me, one for something else. And I could feel it, creeping into my own mind, building a tension that settled into my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to act. Even our routines began to feel off. The coffee we drank together in the mornings no longer sparked the same warmth, the errands we ran felt heavy, purposeful in ways I couldn't name. Her laughter, fleeting, hesitant, reminded me of the old days, but it wasn't enough to calm the unease. The tiny discrepancies piled up until they were impossible to ignore. One night, I caught her standing by the window, the city lights reflecting off her face, notebook in hand. She wasn't aware I was watching. She whispered a name I didn't recognize, and a shiver ran through me. It wasn't just the family influence anymore, it was something deeper, closer, something I hadn't seen because I had been too invested in assigning blame externally. I realized that what I had thought was the root of the problem, the interference of her family, the outside opinions, was only a partial explanation. The truth was something that had existed quietly, persistently, underneath everything we had built together. I could feel it now, in the small hesitations, the careful silences, the fleeting expressions that never reached her full gaze, and yet, I wasn't ready to confront it. Part of me clung to the false truth, to the neat explanation that had spared me from facing the deeper fracture. But every time I looked at her, every small clue, every hesitation, reminded me that the real story, the one that truly explained the distance, the subtle coldness, was still hidden. By the time I went to bed that night, I was certain of one thing: the fracture between us wasn't external. It wasn't her parents, or her job, or the world outside our apartment. The fracture was closer, hidden beneath the layers of familiarity, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself in a way I could no longer ignore. I should have seen it sooner. Every hesitation, every fleeting glance, every subtle pause, they weren't about her family. They weren't even about anyone outside of us. The fracture, the distance, the coldness that had been building like an unseen storm, it had been there all along, rooted in something I had refused to acknowledge. It hit me in a moment so ordinary it almost made it worse. She was sitting across from me, the notebook I had glimpsed still tucked beside her, sketching quietly while I pretended to read on my phone. And then I heard it, her voice, soft, trembling, muttering a phrase I hadn't expected, a name I knew, a memory we both shared but had never spoken about in detail. The weight of it sank in. The emotional bond she had quietly nurtured elsewhere, something intimate, something unresolved, had been influencing her actions toward me far more than I had ever imagined. I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. Everything I had believed, the misdirection toward her family, the false certainty that I had control over the narrative, crumbled in an instant. I realized that her emotional loyalty had never been fully mine, not in the way I thought. It wasn't a betrayal in the traditional sense, but it was a fracture deep enough to threaten the foundation of our relationship. Questions I had ignored, or deliberately avoided, screamed at me. How had I missed this? How had I assumed blame outward when the truth had been here, quiet and persistent, the whole time? I felt the weight of my own blindness, the self-deception that had allowed me to build the false narrative. I had invested everything into a bubble of trust that wasn't as solid as I believed. She looked up then, catching my expression. Her eyes were full of hesitation, of sorrow, and maybe even guilt. I didn't mean for it to happen this way, she whispered. But it didn't feel like an apology, it felt like the acknowledgement of something neither of us had fully confronted. Something that had grown in the spaces between us while I was looking elsewhere. I wanted to reach across the table, to shake sense into myself and into her. But I froze. The shock was physical, a hollow ache in my chest, a tightening in my stomach. The realization that this wasn't about interference, wasn't about outside influence, it was about a bond she had carried quietly, unspoken, unresolved. That had subtly shifted her feelings, her attention, her presence, left me stunned, the rain outside continued its steady drum against the window, echoing the turmoil in my mind. I felt anger, yes, but also guilt. For months I had blamed everything and everyone else for the distance between us. For months I had refused to see what had been under my nose. And now the truth was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a mirror reflecting my own failings, my inability to perceive the depth of her inner life, my desperation to control a narrative I wasn't ready to face. I realized, in that suspended moment, that the emotional fracture between us had been closer than I wanted to admit, from the very beginning. Perhaps, and as I sat there, stunned and silent, I understood that some things could not be fixed by blaming others. The truth had a gravity I wasn't prepared for, and the consequences, for both of us, would echo far beyond this single, quiet revelation. The days after that revelation felt suspended, like the world had slowed while my mind raced. She was there, physically, but something between us had shifted irreversibly. Small gestures, the brushing of hands while cooking, a shared glance during a movie, no longer carried the warmth they once had. Every touch felt tentative, measured, and I realized that trust, once broken, doesn't snap back instantly. It stretches and frays, leaving strands too fragile to hold. I found myself replaying every interaction, every subtle cue I had missed. The pauses, the fleeting looks, the small moments of distance, they weren't random. They weren't caused by her family or outside pressures. They were the echo of an unresolved bond she carried. Something intimate and hidden, that had subtly shifted the way she engaged with me. The truth hit harder because it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, patient, and insidious. I tried to talk to her, to bridge the distance, but words felt inadequate. Every sentence I started seemed to fall flat, misaligned with the weight of what had been revealed. She answered carefully, her voice even, but there was a guardedness that no amount of explanation could erase. The closeness we had taken for granted felt suspended in amber, visible but untouchable. I wrestled with anger, yes, but it was tangled with guilt. For months, I had blamed others, constructing a false narrative to shield myself from facing the reality of our distance. I had ignored the signs, rationalized the inconsistencies, and in doing so, I had allowed the gap to grow. I realized the fracture was not just hers, it was mine too. My blindness, my insistence on assigning blame externally, had amplified the distance between us. At night, I lie awake thinking about the consequences. Could I have noticed sooner? Could I have acted differently, approached her with curiosity instead of assumptions? The moral tension gnaws at me. I want to hold her, to reassure her, to rebuild what I can. But how do you rebuild trust when the truth is so quiet, so close, and yet so difficult to confront? Her presence feels heavier now, filled with unspoken complexities. I catch myself hesitating before speaking, calculating how my words might land, aware that anything could widen the gap further. The intimacy we once had, the effortless understanding, the shared jokes, the comfort of being seen, is now filtered through layers of suspicion, doubt, and restrained emotions, and yet, there are moments, brief, almost cruel in their subtlety, when I see glimpses of what we had. A laugh that sounds nearly real, a hand brushing mine just long enough to remind me of connection. Those moments are fleeting, fragile, but they are reminders that even fractured bonds can carry memory, even if the present feels distant and precarious. I realize now that the aftermath isn't about blame, it's about reckoning. About understanding how deeply we influence one another, and how much of that influence remains hidden until it becomes unavoidable. I feel the weight of my own assumptions pressing down, and I understand, painfully, that the gap between us is both her burden and mine. And as I sit in the quiet of our apartment, listening to the distant hum of the city outside, I wonder if trust can survive the subtle betrayals we never fully anticipated, and if love alone is ever enough when the fractures run deeper than anyone admits. I sit now in the quiet apartment, the rain long gone, the streets outside empty and gleaming with reflected city lights. She's in the other room, probably scrolling on her phone or quietly sketching in that notebook she always keeps close. I don't know what she's thinking, and part of me fears that she doesn't even want me to know. The distance isn't just physical anymore, it's emotional, layered, nuanced, and impossible to erase with words alone. I keep replaying everything, searching for a moment when I could have acted differently. Was I wrong to blame her family so completely, to build a narrative that absolved me of responsibility? I clung to that false truth because it was tidy. Comforting, a way to protect my own ego from the gnawing possibility that the fracture had always been closer than I dared to see, and now, the real truth has settled like a stone in my chest. It wasn't them. It wasn't anyone else. The distance, the subtle withdrawal, the hesitation in her voice, all of it was rooted in something I couldn't control, something I had overlooked, an unresolved bond, intimate and quiet, that she carried within herself. It wasn't betrayal in the traditional sense. It was more complex, more painful, because it exposed the limits of trust and the fragility of understanding even the person closest to you. I wonder if she feels the same weight, the same sense of fracture. Does she blame me? Does she even realize how much I've been struggling to reconcile what I see with what I hoped for? Can we rebuild what's been stretched thin, or has it shifted permanently into something fragile, like a glass sculpture that cannot survive a single tremor? I also feel my own guilt pressing against me. I blamed outward, I assumed external forces were the cause, I refused to see what was in front of me. Did my misreading of the signs push her further away? Did my need for a convenient explanation blind me to her reality, to her emotions, to her autonomy? These questions twist in my mind with no clear answer, and maybe that's the point. Some truths are less about right or wrong and more about the consequences of perception, assumption, and the limits of understanding another human being. I don't have closure. Not really. I can't rewind time, can't undo the assumptions, can't reclaim the moments lost in silence and misinterpretation. All I have are the fragments, the small gestures. The brief touches, the quiet laughs that remind me of what was, and the awareness that love alone doesn't always prevent emotional drift, that loyalty to oneself or others can collide with intimacy in ways neither party anticipates. So I sit here, waiting, wondering if we can navigate the cracks or if they are too deep, too embedded. I wonder if trust can ever be rebuilt after doubt that runs this deep. I wonder if my insecurities, my need for a tidy story, have hurt someone I care about more than I realized, and as I watch her from across the room, notebook closed now, I ask myself the question I can't answer: can loyalty, to family, to self, to unspoken bonds, justify the subtle betrayals we inflict on the ones we love? The answer doesn't come. And maybe it never will.